What if the poorest country in West Africa pulled off the unthinkable? Not in theory, not in dreams, but in cold, hard numbers. No foreign aid, no IMF rescue, no World Bank bailout. Just $4.179 billion in debt, gone, erased, paid in full, and not one dime came from the West. The name of that country? Burkina Faso. A name that, until now, was often spoken with a sigh, a statistic, a footnote. Today, it's the center of the financial world's biggest surprise. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a rupture in the story we've been told about what Africa can and cannot do. When the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, Dr. Apollinaire Kyelem de Tambela, stood before the cameras in 2024 and calmly announced that his country had cleared nearly $5 billion in debt using nothing but domestic resources, the world didn't quite know how to respond. It wasn't a declaration made with fanfare. It was delivered with the quiet force of something permanent. The usual suspects, the IMF, the World Bank, Western aid agencies, had played no part in it. And for the first time in a long time, a developing nation had rewritten the rules without asking for permission. Financial markets froze in a stunned silence. Analysts scrambled to make sense of it. Headlines called it a miracle. But this wasn't magic. This was mathematics, strategy, and most of all, mindset. Burkina Faso had stopped playing the old game and started creating a new one. A game where the West wasn't the dealer, and Africa wasn't the one begging for chips. The country had simply decided, we are not going to wait for help. We are going to help ourselves. It wasn't just what they did. It was how they thought. The real revolution started not in the central bank, but in the national psyche. Instead of begging external lenders for lifelines, the government turned inward. They looked to their own people, their own businesses, their own banks. They believed that trust and unity were more valuable than grants. That pride was more powerful than credit ratings. And for once, they were right. They launched a campaign not of charity, but of confidence. Bonds were issued, domestically. Investors weren't global hedge funds or foreign development institutions. They were shop owners, pension funds, local banks. Ordinary citizens who had grown tired of watching their country's potential sold off piece by piece. And when they saw that their leaders were serious about managing resources wisely, they didn't hesitate. They put their money where their belief was. What Burkina Faso did was more than economic policy. It was psychological warfare against the very idea that African nations are doomed to rely on someone else's approval to move forward. It wasn't just about paying off numbers on a spreadsheet. It was about proving that self-reliance is not just possible, it's sustainable. The world watched in disbelief. Burkina Faso, long labeled fragile, unstable, poor, had just done what supposedly stronger nations still fail to do: take control. Not through speeches, but through action. Not by blaming history, but by rewriting it. The turning point wasn't just political, it was personal. The people of Burkina Faso didn't wait to be saved. They became the solution. With a government determined to ditch foreign dependence, the state introduced a bold, new financial move: domestic bonds. But these weren't abstract instruments for global bankers. These were real, tangible commitments that everyday citizens could invest in. And they did, by the thousands. Teachers, shopkeepers, small business owners, even retirees. They weren't betting on a quick return. They were investing in a country they finally believed in. For decades, the narrative around Africa has been that people flee when things get tough, that the poor are too poor to contribute, that instability repels capital like fire repels water. But Burkina Faso proved that story false. This was a nation surrounded by chaos, armed insurgencies, terrorist threats, a volatile political backdrop. And yet, instead of running, investors stayed. Instead of hiding their money, they moved it toward the heart of the government's mission. Confidence didn't shrink. It grew. This defied all conventional wisdom. In most crisis zones, trust evaporates. But here, it thickened. Why? Because the government didn't just ask for money. They showed discipline. They demonstrated where every cent would go and why. They introduced fiscal transparency with unusual consistency. There were no shadowy budget holes, no bloated ministries bleeding funds unchecked. People could see roads being paved, power lines going up, systems being built. Accountability wasn't a promise. It was practice. That's what made the difference. Trust became the currency, not just between the state and the people, but between citizens themselves. It created a loop of optimism that hadn't existed in generations. And behind all this stood another layer of reassurance: gold. Burkina Faso is one of the top gold producers in Africa. For years, that wealth left the country faster than it entered, funneled through foreign companies, lost in rigged contracts. But now, the government had a new idea: use what they already had to back what they wanted to build. Revenues from the gold sector became collateral, security for bondholders, a guarantee that this wasn't just political theatre. It was a financial structure backed by real, tangible assets. For the first time, the country's most valuable natural resource wasn't being extracted to enrich someone else. It was being used to stabilize the domestic economy from the inside out. Investors knew that even in worst-case scenarios, there was gold behind their trust. And that knowledge, combined with leadership, strategy, and belief, turned a fragile nation into a fortress of self-financed ambition. For the first time in its modern history, Burkina Faso's financial system wasn't an obstacle to development. It became its engine. The banks, once hesitant players stuck between regulation and risk, stepped forward. Pension funds, typically conservative by design, shifted their portfolios to include government bonds. Not out of pressure, but out of belief. The signals from the top were clear. This wasn't a one-time campaign. It was the start of a new national economy rooted in internal trust. The state didn't go it alone. Private businesses, some small, some national giants, began to pour capital into public infrastructure, not as charity, but as strategy. Roads that improved logistics, energy grids that powered production, transport systems that connected isolated markets. These investments were designed to benefit both the investor and the country. And for once, public and private interests were not at war. They were aligned. This alignment wasn't accidental. The government deliberately crafted an economic climate where cooperation replaced competition. Companies were encouraged to see themselves not as bystanders to national policy, but as participants in its success. They were given pathways to invest not just for return, but for impact. This spirit of shared responsibility became contagious. And as momentum built, something remarkable began to happen: financial inclusion. Bond markets, once viewed as the domain of elite institutions, opened their doors. Farmers, small shop owners, even young professionals in urban centers found ways to participate. Whether through simplified purchasing systems, mobile platforms, or cooperative pooling, the barriers fell. For the first time, financial instruments became part of everyday conversations. Investing in the nation wasn't just for the wealthy. It became a patriotic act, a cultural shift. And with every bond sold, every investor engaged, every project launched, the past began to loosen its grip. The national debt, once a symbol of shame and stagnation, transformed into a catalyst. The money raised didn't disappear into bureaucratic black holes. It was funneled into transformation. New roads carved across trade corridors. Energy projects lit up dark regions. Mining operations moved under national oversight with long-term sustainability in mind. This wasn't just about balancing the books. Burkina Faso wasn't interested in simply erasing numbers. It was creating opportunity. Debt repayment wasn't treated like a burden to escape. It was turned into fuel for mobility, for productivity, for pride. In a continent often told that debt equals dependence, Burkina Faso showed that debt, if managed wisely and funded locally, can become the launchpad for something radically new. Burkina Faso understood something that many still overlook. Independence doesn't survive on slogans, it stands on foundations. So while the world debated ideology, the country laid concrete. Roads were paved not just to connect cities, but to connect futures. Electricity grids were expanded to light up more than homes. They powered small industries, rural clinics, and schools once trapped in darkness. Mining operations were reclaimed and reorganized not just for profit, but for sovereignty. Infrastructure wasn't decoration, it was declaration. A declaration that the country was building not for donors, but for itself. And as the cement dried and the wires hummed with current, something intangible began to spread. The projects were physical, but the message was emotional. Burkina Faso wasn't just paying off its debts, it was reshaping its image to its citizens, to its neighbors, to the world. No longer a nation waiting for permission or pity, it was becoming something far more powerful, an author of its own destiny. The financial independence was real, but the psychological shift was even greater. The country no longer carried the tone of the beggar, it had found the posture of the builder. But just as this momentum began to gather speed, the West made its position known. After the military-led transition in 2022, Western powers didn't extend a hand. They drew a line. Sanctions came swiftly. Aid was suspended. Development funds were frozen. The justification was wrapped in the language of democracy, but the intention was clear. Pressure the new government into retreat. Punish the country until it surrendered its autonomy and returned to acceptable leadership. One that would keep playing the old game. It wasn't just economic, it was strategic. The West had calculated that without their support, Burkina Faso would fold, that markets would dry up, that people would lose faith, that unrest would boil over, forcing a return to the status quo. A government more compliant, more manageable, more dependent. What they didn't count on was resilience. They didn't expect a nation ready to navigate without their maps, and they certainly didn't believe that sanctions would backfire, not by collapsing the country, but by strengthening its resolve. The bet had been placed, isolate them, and they'll fall. But Burkina Faso didn't flinch. Instead, it doubled down. Not in defiance, but in quiet confidence. The kind that no external force can truly comprehend until it's too late. Burkina Faso chose not to play by the rules because the rules were never made for it to win. Sanctions were supposed to be a trapdoor, isolation, a punishment. But what followed wasn't collapse, it was acceleration. The country didn't stall, it sprinted. Domestic systems adapted. Local investors stepped forward. The government, instead of bending to pressure, shifted deeper into its strategy of internal mobilization. And it worked. The world had seen many nations falter under less pressure. Yet here stood a small, landlocked country, pushing forward with a pace that no one saw coming. What made it all the more remarkable was that Burkina Faso didn't just survive outside the West's financial safety net, it flourished. There were no billion-dollar donations, no international lifelines, no flashy aid programs. And yet roads were being built, schools funded, energy systems upgraded, and investors paid on time. This was the antithesis of the model that had dominated African economics for decades. The message was unmistakable. You don't need to be a client state to succeed. Dependency isn't destiny. In a continent long framed as helpless, this was a rupture. Burkina Faso shattered the stereotype of the poor African nation. It wasn't begging. It wasn't waiting. It wasn't obeying. It was building. It was choosing. It was succeeding on its own terms. This wasn't just economic. It was symbolic. For generations, African countries were told they must accept help to survive. Now, one of the least likely among them was saying, "Help is not always help, and we never needed your permission to thrive." And yet, despite this breakthrough, the continent remained largely silent. No wave of similar declarations, no public embrace from neighboring governments, no avalanche of leaders announcing their own plans for self-reliance. Why? Why, when the blueprint was clear, did so many choose to look the other way? Burkina Faso had exposed the truth that dependency is not inevitable. It's a decision, a difficult one, yes, risky, uncomfortable, but also possible. And in revealing that truth, it held up a mirror to the rest of Africa. Some didn't like what they saw, because choosing autonomy requires sacrifice. It means saying no to money that comes with strings. It means confronting internal inefficiencies instead of blaming external ones. It means replacing the comfort of excuses with the burden of responsibility. The question now isn't whether Burkina Faso has succeeded. It has. The question is, who will follow? The truth many avoid is this: Africa's poverty isn't natural. It's engineered. Dependency has been designed, encouraged, and institutionalized. For decades, Western powers have built systems that keep African nations reliant on loans, aid, and charity, while quietly draining the continent's real wealth. From gold and oil to cobalt and rare earth minerals, the extraction hasn't stopped. It's just become more refined, more hidden behind contracts and institutions. The image of Africa as forever needy serves a purpose. It justifies control. It protects profit. It hides the uncomfortable fact that while Africa receives billions in aid, it loses trillions in value. That's the uncomfortable mechanism few want to name. Dependency is profitable for those who sit at the top of the system. It's not about helping Africa grow. It's about making sure it grows in directions that serve others. And the fewer questions asked, the smoother the process runs. Which is why what Burkina Faso did isn't just brave. It's dangerous to that model. They didn't just reject the money. They rejected the logic that said they couldn't exist without it. And that makes them a precedent others weren't supposed to see. This wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't chaos. It was strategy, leadership, vision. It was local capital replacing foreign debt. It was internal trust replacing external approval. It was proof that the rules we were told to follow aren't laws, they're choices. Burkina Faso made a different choice, and it worked. So what happens when more countries realize that aid isn't their only path? What happens when the narrative shifts from dependence to design? What happens when a continent stops asking what it's allowed to do and starts deciding what it wants to become? That's where the real revolution lies, not in policies or headlines, but in mindset. The biggest barrier isn't financial. It's psychological. For too long, African leaders have been conditioned to believe they must appease, that survival depends on maintaining favor, that growth is something imported, not homegrown. But Burkina Faso proved otherwise. They didn't wait for new systems to be offered. They created one. And in doing so, they gave every other African nation permission to do the same. Not by imitation, but by imagination. By the willingness to believe that what was once unimaginable is now inevitable. That real power doesn't come from compliance, but from courage. Real strength was never waiting outside Africa's borders. It was here all along, in the minds of its people, the resilience of its entrepreneurs, the quiet resolve of farmers, workers, and teachers. In the small banks that chose to believe, in the pension funds that backed the government, in the local markets that didn't collapse under pressure, but instead rallied behind a national cause. The West offered loans. Burkina Faso chose to bet on itself. And that decision changed everything. Because when a country stops measuring its worth by what it receives and starts defining itself by what it builds, it lays the groundwork for something far greater than fiscal recovery. It begins to reclaim its freedom. You cannot be politically sovereign while financially shackled. Debt is controlled disguised as assistance. And Burkina Faso understood that until you own your economy, you will always be renting your future. By turning away from the traditional path and walking into uncertainty with nothing but conviction, the nation didn't isolate itself. It liberated itself. This wasn't about survival. It was about dignity, the freedom to decide, the freedom to resist, the freedom to rise, not in someone else's model, but in its own. And now, it stands not as an outlier, but as a signal. This wasn't a one-time act of rebellion. It was the first tremor of something much bigger. A new African era, led not by what others give us, but by what we already possess. Burkina Faso was not the end of the sentence. It was the capital letter at the start of a new paragraph. This isn't about one country anymore. It's about the millions watching, wondering, questioning. It's about the leaders who stay silent today, but feel the pressure building in their own hearts. It's about the people across the continent who whisper to each other, "If they can do it, why not us?" Because that's the power of an example. It doesn't need to persuade, it inspires. The world is watching, the West is waiting, but Africa is waking up. And the only question left is, who's next?